I was standing at my kitchen window with my morning coffee when I saw Patricia Brennan from the HOA marching across my property with a clipboard. Her face already twisted in that trademark scowl that made everyone in the neighborhood cringe. This was going to be trouble, and I knew it the moment she stepped onto my land without permission. My name is Brandon Henderson, and I had moved to this 10-acre property outside Cedar Rapids, Iowa about 8 months ago. The place was perfect for what I wanted to do with my life after retiring early from software engineering at 38. I had always dreamed of running a small farm, nothing massive, just enough to feel connected to the land and make some extra income. The property came with an old barn, decent soil, and most importantly, it qualified for agricultural exemption under Iowa law. I watched Patricia stop near my chicken coops, scribbling furiously on her clipboard. She was wearing her usual HOA president outfit, a crisp blazer that looked completely out of place on a farm and those expensive shoes that were now covered in mud. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Setting down my coffee, I headed outside. The morning air was cool, typical for early April in Iowa, and my boots squished in the soft ground as I walked toward her. My dozen chickens were clucking around their coop, and I could see Patricia eyeing them like they were some kind of plague. "Morning, Patricia," I called out, keeping my tone neutral. "Can I help you with something?" She spun around, her highlighted blonde hair barely moving in the breeze thanks to what must have been half a can of hairspray. "Mr. Henderson, I am conducting an inspection of your property. We have received multiple complaints from your neighbors about the condition of your land and the activities you are conducting here." I crossed my arms. "Multiple complaints? From who?" "That information is confidential," she snapped, her pen tapping against the clipboard. "What I can tell you is that this HOA has standards, and your property is violating several of them. These chickens, for instance, are creating noise pollution, and that smell from your compost heap is absolutely unacceptable. Patricia, my property has an agricultural exemption. I filed all the paperwork with the county when I moved in. I am running a legal farming operation here." Her eyes narrowed. "I do not care what paperwork you think you filed. This is a residential community with rules and regulations that every homeowner must follow. Your so-called farming operation is bringing down property values and creating a nuisance for your neighbors." I took a deep breath, reminding myself to stay calm. The agricultural exemption is protected by Iowa state law. The HOA covenants cannot override state agricultural protection statutes. I looked into all of this before I started. "We will see about that," Patricia said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I am issuing you a formal notice of violation. You have 30 days to remove all farm animals from your property, dismantle these unsightly structures, and restore your land to an acceptable residential appearance. Failure to comply will result in daily fines of $200. She thrust a piece of paper at me, which I took but did not look at. "You cannot fine me for legal farming activities, Patricia." "Watch me," she said, turning on her heel and marching back toward the road where her pristine white SUV was parked. Mud splattered on her shoes with every step, and I could see her grimace with each one. After she left, I went back inside and actually read the violation notice. It was worse than I thought. According to the document, I was in violation of sections regarding livestock, agricultural structures, commercial activities on residential property, and aesthetic standards. The list went on for 2 full pages. They wanted me to remove my chickens, tear down the expanded coop I had just built, stop my small vegetable garden that I sold produce from at the local farmer's market, and even remove the beehives I kept on the far edge of my property. I sat at my kitchen table and pulled out my folder of documents. When I bought this property, I had been extremely careful about understanding my rights. Iowa has strong agricultural protection laws, specifically the Agricultural Areas Statute and the Right to Farm Act. My property was zoned agricultural, and I had properly registered with the county as a farm operation. I paid agricultural property taxes, which were actually lower than residential taxes. I had done everything by the book. The problem was that this neighborhood, Meadowbrook Estates, had been developed about 15 years ago with an HOA that had extremely restrictive covenants. Most of the properties were 1 to 2 acres, typical suburban lots with manicured lawns and houses that all looked vaguely similar. My property was different. It had been farmland that got absorbed into the development, and the original owner had fought to keep it zoned agricultural. When he passed away, his children sold it, and that is when I bought it. I spent the rest of the morning researching and making calls. First, I contacted the county zoning office and confirmed that my agricultural exemption was still active and valid. The clerk I spoke with, a friendly woman named Dorothy, assured me that everything was in order and that HOA covenants could not supersede state agricultural protections. "You are not the first person to have this issue," Dorothy told me over the phone. HOAs try this all the time, especially in areas where farming properties got developed around, but the law is clear. If you have a legitimate agricultural operation and the property is properly zoned, they cannot force you to stop. "What should I do about their violation notice?" I asked. "Document everything. Take photos, keep records of your farming activities, sales receipts if you sell any products, everything. And I would recommend getting a lawyer who specializes in agricultural law. The county can provide you with some resources, but you will want legal representation if this escalates." I thanked her and hung up, feeling slightly better but still frustrated. I had not moved out here to fight with an HOA. I had moved here to live peacefully and pursue my dream of farming. The next day, I received an email from Patricia with the violation notice attached, along with additional documentation about the fines and the HOA's enforcement procedures. She had also CC'd the entire HOA board, which consisted of 5 people total. I recognized a few of the names from neighborhood meetings I had attended when I first moved in. I decided to respond professionally, but firmly. I drafted an email explaining my agricultural exemption, cited the relevant Iowa statutes, and attached copies of my county registration documents. I explained that my farming operation was completely legal and that the HOA had no authority to regulate agricultural activities on properly zoned farmland. Patricia's response came within an hour. It was curt and dismissive. "Your interpretation of the law is incorrect. The HOA covenants take precedence on all properties within Meadowbrook Estates. You will comply with the violation notice or face fines. This is your final warning." That email made my blood boil. I forwarded the entire exchange to my friend Marcus, who was a lawyer, though not one who specialized in agricultural law. He called me that evening. "Brandon, you need to take this seriously," Marcus said. HOAs can be incredibly aggressive, and even if they are wrong, they can make your life miserable with legal fees and constant harassment. You need someone who knows agricultural law inside and out. Can you recommend anyone? Actually, yes. There is a firm in Des Moines, Sullivan and Associates. They handle a lot of agricultural cases, including right-to-farm disputes. I will send you their contact information. I called Sullivan and Associates first thing the next morning and spoke with an attorney named Robert Sullivan. He listened to my situation, asked detailed questions about my farming operation, and requested copies of all my documents. "This is pretty straightforward," Robert said after reviewing everything. "You have a textbook case of protected agricultural activity. The HOA has no legal standing to fine you or force you to cease operations. However, I should warn you that HOAs sometimes do not care about the law. They will try to intimidate you, and they might even file a lawsuit hoping you will give up. What are my options? We can send them a cease and desist letter explaining the legal situation. If they continue with fines or harassment, we can file for an injunction and potentially sue them for violations of your rights under Iowa agricultural protection statutes. There is also the possibility of recovering attorney fees if it goes to court and we prevail. Let's start with the cease and desist letter," I said. "I want to give them a chance to back down before this gets ugly." Robert drafted a comprehensive cease and desist letter that cited chapter and verse of Iowa law. He explained the Right to Farm Act, the agricultural exemption statutes, and the Iowa Supreme Court precedents that protected farmers from exactly this kind of HOA overreach. The letter was professional but firm, making it clear that any further harassment or attempts to fine me would result in legal action. The letter was sent via certified mail to Patricia and all members of the HOA board. For a few days, there was silence. I actually started to hope that maybe they would see reason and drop the issue. I was wrong. A week later, I found a notice posted on my front door. It was another violation notice, this time with photos attached. Someone had been on my property taking pictures of my chickens, my vegetable garden, my compost area, and even my beehives. The notice claimed I was running an illegal commercial operation and creating health hazards. The fine had been increased to $500 per day, retroactive to the date of the first violation notice. According to their math, I now owed $15,000 in fines. I immediately called Robert Sullivan. "They are not backing down. In fact, they are doubling down." "Send me photos of the notice," Robert said. "This is harassment and it is probably illegal. They are also trespassing if they are coming onto your property to take photos without permission." I sent him the photos, and we had a long conversation about next steps. Robert recommended that I install security cameras to document any future trespassing, and that we immediately file for an injunction to stop the HOA from assessing fines. "We are also going to send a letter to their attorney if they have one," Robert said. "And we are going to make it very clear that they are opening themselves up to significant liability." Over the next few days, I installed 4 security cameras around my property, covering the main access points and the areas where my farming activities were concentrated. I also put up no trespassing signs at the property boundaries, though I knew from my research that HOA board members sometimes claimed they had the right to inspect properties. The cameras proved invaluable almost immediately. 2 days after I installed them, I caught Patricia and another HOA board member, a man named Douglas Fenwick, walking around my property at 7 in the morning. They were taking more photos and even appeared to be measuring distances from my chicken coop to the property line. I watched the footage later that day and saw Patricia pointing at various things and Douglas writing in a notebook. At one point, Patricia walked right up to my chicken coop and seemed to be trying to count the birds. One of my roosters, a feisty Rhode Island red named Clint, chased her away from the fence, and I could not help but laugh at the footage of her stumbling backward in her heels. I sent the video footage to Robert, along with the exact timestamps. They are still trespassing, even after the cease and desist. Robert's response was swift. "That's it. We are filing for an injunction and we are including a claim for harassment and trespassing. I am also going to contact the county sheriff about the trespassing. This has gone beyond an HOA dispute. They are breaking the law. The legal wheels started turning quickly after that. Robert filed a motion for a temporary restraining order and an injunction in the Lynn County District Court. The filing outlined my agricultural exemption, the HOA's illegal attempts to fine me and force me to cease farming operations, and the repeated trespassing incidents despite the cease and desist letter. The hearing for the temporary restraining order was scheduled for 2 weeks later. In the meantime, Robert also contacted the county sheriff's office about the trespassing. A deputy came out to my property, reviewed the security footage, and took a statement from me. This is pretty clear-cut trespassing, the deputy, whose name was Officer Ramirez, told me. Especially since you have posted no trespassing signs and they have been warned. I am going to have a conversation with Miss Brennan and Mr. Fenwick. If they continue to come onto your property without permission, you can press charges. I appreciate that, I said. I just want to be left alone to run my farm. Officer Ramirez nodded. I grew up on a farm, I understand. These HOA types sometimes think they run the world. A few days later, I got an angry call from Patricia. You called the police on me. How dare you? I have every right as HOA president to inspect properties for violations. No, you do not, I said calmly. You have no right to trespass on my property. I have clearly posted no trespassing signs and you were warned by my attorney. If you come onto my property again without permission, I will press charges. This is outrageous, Patricia sputtered. The HOA board is meeting tomorrow night, and we are discussing taking legal action against you for your refusal to comply with our covenants. You do what you need to do, Patricia. I will see you in court. She hung up on me, and I sat there feeling both annoyed and amused. The situation was escalating, but I felt confident in my legal position. I had done everything right, and the HOA was clearly in the wrong. The HOA board meeting that Patricia mentioned was actually a fascinating development. One of my neighbors, a retired teacher named Susan Grayson who lived about half a mile down the road, reached out to me the day after the meeting. Brandon, I wanted you to know what happened at the board meeting last night, Susan said when I answered her call. I have been on the fence about this whole situation, but after last night I think Patricia and the board are way out of line. What happened? Patricia spent 45 minutes ranting about your farm. She showed photos, talked about property values, and basically painted you as some kind of criminal. But then Douglas mentioned that they had consulted with an attorney, and the attorney apparently told them that their legal position is weak because of your agricultural exemption. Really? So they know they do not have a case. That's the thing, Susan continued. Patricia dismissed the attorney's concerns. She said that HOA covenants are binding contracts and that you agreed to them when you bought the property. She convinced the board to authorize spending up to $50,000 in legal fees to fight this. I let out a low whistle. $50,000 of the HOA's money to fight a losing battle. Exactly. Several people at the meeting objected, including me. I pointed out that this seemed like a waste of everyone's money, especially when you are not actually harming anyone. But Patricia claimed that if they do not enforce the covenants against you, it sets a precedent that will destroy the neighborhood. That is ridiculous. I know. But she has convinced most of the board that this is an existential threat. I just wanted to warn you that they are going to fight this hard, even if it is stupid. I thanked Susan for the information and immediately called Robert to update him. He was not surprised. HOAs often act irrationally, Robert said. They get so focused on control and enforcement that they lose sight of reality. But this actually works in our favor. If they are spending $50,000 to fight a clear-cut case of protected agricultural activity, it shows their bad faith. That could factor into recovering attorney fees later. The hearing for the temporary restraining order arrived on a Tuesday morning. I met Robert at the Lynn County Courthouse, an imposing building in downtown Cedar Rapids. I had dressed in clean jeans and a button-up shirt, trying to look respectable but still like a farmer. Patricia arrived with two other board members and their attorney, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit named Gregory Mitchell. Patricia was dressed like she was going to a corporate board meeting, and she kept shooting me hostile glares across the courtroom. The judge, a woman named Judge Elizabeth Thornton, called the hearing to order and asked Robert to present our case first. Robert stood and laid out the facts clearly and concisely. He explained my agricultural exemption, the HOA's violation notices and fines, the trespassing incidents, and the legal protections afforded to me under Iowa law. Your Honor, this is a straightforward case of an HOA attempting to override state agricultural protection statutes, Robert said. Mr. Henderson has a legitimate farming operation on properly zoned agricultural land. The Iowa Right to Farm Act specifically prevents HOAs from restricting agricultural activities in situations like this. The HOA's actions constitute harassment and an illegal attempt to force my client to abandon his lawful business. Judge Thornton listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Then she turned to Gregory Mitchell, the HOA's attorney. Mr. Mitchell, what is the HOA's position? Mitchell stood and launched into an argument about the sanctity of HOA covenants and binding contracts. Your Honor, when Mr. Henderson purchased his property, he agreed to abide by the Meadowbrook Estate's covenants, conditions, and restrictions. These covenants explicitly prohibit livestock and commercial agricultural operations on residential properties. The HOA has not only the right but the obligation to enforce these covenants uniformly. What about the agricultural exemption and the Right to Farm Act? Judge Thornton asked. Your Honor, we believe that the covenants were in place before Mr. Henderson's agricultural activities began, and therefore they take precedence. He voluntarily agreed to these restrictions when he purchased the property. Robert stood up for rebuttal. Your Honor, if I may, the property has been zoned agricultural for over 50 years. The agricultural zoning predates the HOA by decades. Iowa law is explicit that HOA covenants cannot override agricultural zoning and the right to farm protections. There are multiple Iowa Supreme Court cases supporting this position. Judge Thornton nodded thoughtfully. I am familiar with the relevant case law, Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Mitchell, can you cite any cases where HOA covenants were found to supersede state agricultural protections? Mitchell hesitated. Your Honor, this is a unique situation. We believe that the specific facts of this case warrant a different analysis. That is not an answer to my question, Mr. Mitchell. The hearing continued for another 30 minutes with both sides presenting arguments and evidence. I was called to testify briefly about my farming operation, and I explained that I had 12 chickens, 3 beehives, and a vegetable garden that I sold produce from at the local farmers market. I also mentioned that I was planning to add some goats in the future for dairy products. Patricia's face turned red when I mentioned the goats, and I saw her whisper something urgently to Mitchell. Finally, Judge Thornton announced her decision. I am granting the temporary restraining order. The HOA is enjoined from assessing any fines against Mr. Henderson for his agricultural activities and from trespassing on his property. Based on the evidence presented and Iowa law, it appears that Mr. Henderson's farming operation is protected by state agricultural exemption statutes. This restraining order will remain in effect pending a full hearing on the merits, which I am scheduling for 60 days from now. She banged her gavel, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Robert shook my hand and smiled. That went as well as we could have hoped. The judge clearly understands the law. As we were leaving the courtroom, Patricia confronted me in the hallway. "This is not over, Mr. Henderson. We will appeal this and we will win. You cannot just ignore the rules that everyone else has to follow." "Patricia, you are wasting the HOA's money on a losing battle," I said, trying to keep my tone calm. "Why do not you just accept that I have the legal right to farm my land?" "Because you are destroying our neighborhood," she hissed. "Property values are already dropping because of your little farm experiment. People do not want to live next to a barnyard." "Has anyone actually complained besides you?" I asked. "Because I have talked to several neighbors and they seem fine with what I am doing. Some of them even buy eggs from me." Patricia's eyes widened. "You are selling products. That is definitely a commercial operation. We are going to add that to our complaint." She stormed off before I could respond, and Robert just shook his head. She is going to keep pushing this until it blows up in her face. Over the next few weeks, life settled into an uneasy calm. The HOA could not find me because of the restraining order, and they stayed off my property. I continued my farming activities and even expanded them a bit. I added 6 more chickens, bringing my total flock to 18. And I started construction on a small greenhouse for winter growing. Susan Grayson stopped by one afternoon with her husband, Carl. They wanted to buy some eggs and see my setup. "Your place is really coming together," Carl said, admiring my chicken coops. "I grew up on a farm in Nebraska and this reminds me of home." "Thanks," I said, handing them a carton of fresh eggs. "It has been a lot of work, but I love it." "We heard about the court hearing," Susan said. "Patricia is not happy. She has been calling board meetings almost every week, trying to figure out how to fight this." "Is the rest of the board on board with spending all that money?" I asked. Carl shook his head. "Not everyone. There is a lot of tension. Some board members think this is a waste of resources, but Patricia has convinced the majority that it is about principle." "Well, I am not backing down," I said firmly. "This is my property, and I have every legal right to farm it." About a month after the restraining order hearing, something interesting happened. I received a letter from a group of homeowners in Meadowbrook Estates asking if they could visit my farm. The letter was signed by 9 different families, including Susan and Carl. I called Susan to ask about it. "What is this about?" "A bunch of us have been talking," Susan explained. "We actually think what you are doing is great. We would love to see your operation and maybe learn about how you did it. A few people are even interested in starting their own small gardens or getting chickens." I was surprised but pleased. "Sure, I would be happy to have you all over. How about this Saturday afternoon?" That Saturday, 15 people showed up at my farm. I gave them a tour, explaining my setup, the chickens, the bees, and my vegetable garden. People asked lots of questions, and several mentioned that they wished they could do something similar on their properties. "Why can't you?" I asked. "The HOA covenants," one man said. "We are not allowed to have chickens or gardens that are too large. Everything has to be ornamental." "That is ridiculous," I said. "Fresh eggs and vegetables are great, plus it is good for the environment." The visit was a success, and several people bought eggs and vegetables from me before they left. More importantly, I had won over a significant portion of the neighborhood. Patricia's narrative that I was destroying property values and creating a nuisance was falling apart. The following week, I found out just how much I had gotten under Patricia's skin. I received a notice that the HOA had filed a formal lawsuit against me, seeking to enforce the covenants and claiming damages for loss of property values. The lawsuit claimed that my farming activities had decreased property values in Meadowbrook Estates by an average of 10%, resulting in millions of dollars in damages to homeowners. I immediately called Robert. "Did you see the lawsuit?" "Just got it," Robert said. "This is actually good news for us." "How is this good news?" "Because they are making specific claims that we can disprove. They claim property values have dropped 10% because of your farm. We can get expert testimony and market analysis to show that's not true. In fact, I would bet that property values in your area have been stable or even increasing." "So what do? We file a motion to dismiss based on the agricultural exemption, and we countersue for malicious prosecution, harassment, and attorney fees. If we win, which I believe we will, the HOA could be on the hook for significant damages." The legal battle intensified over the next few months. Robert filed our motion to dismiss and our countersuit. The HOA fought back with their own motions and discovery requests. They demanded financial records of my farming operation, photos of every inch of my property, and even tried to depose some of my neighbors. The process was stressful and expensive, even though Robert was confident we would win. I had to spend hours preparing documents, sitting for depositions, and dealing with the constant legal pressure. Patricia seemed to take personal pleasure in making the process as difficult as possible. During my deposition, which was conducted in a conference room at Gregory Mitchell's law office, Patricia sat in the corner of the room with her arms crossed, glaring at me the entire time. Mitchell asked me hundreds of questions about my farming operation, my finances, and my intentions for the property. "Mr. Henderson, is it true that you plan to add goats to your property?" Mitchell asked. "Yes, at some point I would like to have a few dairy goats. And pigs." "I have not decided about pigs. Maybe, maybe not." "What about cows?" "No, I do not have enough land for cows." The questions went on like that for hours, with Mitchell trying to paint me as someone planning to turn the neighborhood into a massive industrial farm. I answered everything honestly and calmly, and Robert objected whenever Mitchell's questions got too ridiculous. At one point, Mitchell asked, "Mr. Henderson, do you care at all about your neighbors and the impact your activities have on them?" "Of course I care," I said. "But my activities are legal and are not harming anyone. I keep my property clean, my animals are well cared for, and I follow all applicable laws and regulations. Several of my neighbors actually support what I am doing. But you admit that some neighbors have complained." "I have only heard complaints from Patricia and the HOA board. I have not received any direct complaints from other neighbors. In fact, many of them buy eggs and vegetables from me regularly." Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her seat, and I saw Mitchell glance at her with what looked like frustration. The case dragged on through the summer. The full hearing on the merits was scheduled for September, almost 6 months after the initial restraining order. During that time, my farm continued to thrive. I added the goats, 2 friendly Nubians that I named Daisy and Clover. They provided milk that I used to make cheese, which became popular at the farmers market. I also made a point of documenting everything about my farm. I kept detailed financial records showing that I was running a legitimate agricultural business, not just a hobby. I sold eggs, vegetables, honey from my bees, and goat cheese. My annual gross income from the farm was modest, around $15,000, but it was enough to clearly establish that this was a bona fide agricultural operation. In August, something unexpected happened. A local newspaper, the Cedar Rapids Gazette, ran a story about my situation. A reporter named Jennifer Chen had somehow heard about the case and wanted to write about the conflict between HOAs and agricultural rights. Jennifer came to my property for an interview, and we spent 2 hours talking about farming, HOA overreach, and the legal battle. She also interviewed Patricia, though I heard later that Patricia was furious with how she was portrayed in the article. The article ran on the front page of the local section with the headline, "HOA Battles Farmer Over Agricultural Rights." It was a fair and balanced piece, presenting both sides of the issue. But the comments section and letters to the editor that followed were overwhelmingly in my favor. People were outraged that an HOA was trying to prevent someone from farming on agricultural land. The publicity put additional pressure on the HOA. Several homeowners in Meadowbrook Estates started questioning why the HOA was spending so much money on legal fees. At the next HOA board meeting, which I did not attend but heard about from Susan, there was a heated debate about whether to continue the lawsuit. Patricia barely maintained control of the meeting, Susan told me over the phone. At least 3 board members wanted to drop the lawsuit and settle. But Patricia insisted that giving up would set a terrible precedent. She actually started yelling at people who disagreed with her. "Sounds like she is losing support," I said. "She is. And honestly, I think the other board members are starting to realize they are going to lose this case." Their attorney has apparently been warning them about the risks, but Patricia keeps pushing. The full hearing finally arrived in mid-September. It was scheduled for a full day in front of Judge Thornton. Both sides had prepared extensive evidence, expert witnesses, and legal arguments. Robert had lined up an expert witness, a real estate appraiser named Thomas Wright, who had analyzed property values in Meadowbrook Estates. His conclusion was that there had been no decrease in property values attributable to my farming activities. In fact, properties in the neighborhood had appreciated slightly over the past year, consistent with broader market trends. The HOA had their own expert, a man named Richard Foster, who claimed that my farm had indeed decreased property values. But during cross-examination, Robert tore apart his methodology, showing that Foster had used flawed comparisons and had cherry-picked data to support his conclusion. I testified again, this time in more detail about my farming operation and my compliance with all agricultural regulations. Robert also called several of my neighbors as witnesses, including Susan and Carl, who testified that they had no problem with my farm and actually appreciated having a local source of fresh food. The HOA called Patricia as their main witness. She took the stand and launched into a long speech about the importance of HOA covenants and the need to maintain neighborhood standards. If we allow Mr. Henderson to ignore our covenants, what's to stop every homeowner from doing whatever they want? We could have people parking RVs in their front yards, painting their houses purple, or running illegal businesses. The covenants exist for a reason. Robert cross-examined her relentlessly. "Miss Brennan, you understand that Mr. Henderson's property is zoned agricultural, correct?" "Yes, but he agreed to the covenants when he bought the property." "Are you aware of the Iowa Right to Farm Act?" "I have heard of it, yes." "And are you aware that Iowa law specifically protects agricultural operations from HOA restrictions?" Patricia hesitated. "Our attorney has explained that the law is complicated and open to interpretation." "Miss Brennan, how much has the HOA spent on legal fees in this case so far?" "I do not have the exact figure." "Would it surprise you to learn that the HOA has spent over $43,000 as of last week?" Patricia's face flushed. "We are defending the rights of all homeowners in Meadowbrook Estates. That is our responsibility." And has any homeowner other than you personally complained about Mr. Henderson's farm? Several people have expressed concerns. Can you name any of them? Patricia stumbled over her words. I do not recall specific names off the top of my head, but there have been complaints. Robert pressed harder. Miss Brennan, is it true that you have personally visited Mr. Henderson's property multiple times without permission, even after being warned about trespassing? I was conducting HOA business, even after being told by law enforcement that you were trespassing. I have a right to inspect properties for violations. No, Miss Brennan, you do not have that right. Mr. Henderson has clearly posted no trespassing signs and has asked you to stay off his property. Your continued presence on his land constitutes criminal trespassing, does it not? Gregory Mitchell objected, and Judge Thornton sustained the objection. But the damage was done. Patricia looked flustered and angry, and it was clear that the judge was not impressed with her testimony. The hearing wrapped up late in the afternoon. Both sides gave closing arguments, and Judge Thornton said she would issue a written ruling within 30 days. I think that went very well, Robert told me as we left the courthouse. The judge seemed skeptical of the HOA's arguments, and their property value expert was a disaster. I would be surprised if we do not win this. The waiting was agonizing. I tried to focus on my farm and not think about the case, but it was hard not to worry. I had invested so much time and money into fighting the HOA, and while I was confident in my legal position, you never really know what a judge will decide. 3 weeks later, I received a call from Robert. We won. Judge Thornton just issued her ruling, and it's a complete victory. She dismissed the HOA's lawsuit with prejudice and ruled in our favor on all counts of the countersuit. I let out a breath I did not realize I was holding. What does that mean exactly? It means the HOA cannot fine you, cannot restrict your farming activities, and has been ordered to pay your attorney fees. Judge Thornton also issued a permanent injunction prohibiting the HOA from harassing you or trespassing on your property. And she awarded you $10,000 in damages for the harassment and malicious prosecution. That is amazing, I said, feeling a surge of relief and vindication. It gets better, Robert continued. Judge Thornton's ruling is very strongly worded. She basically said that the HOA's actions were legally baseless and that they should have known they had no case. She cited multiple Iowa Supreme Court precedents protecting agricultural rights. This ruling is going to be cited in future cases, I guarantee it. I was elated, but I also felt exhausted. The fight had taken a toll on me emotionally and financially, even though I would recover my attorney fees. What happens now? The HOA has 30 days to appeal, but I doubt they will. Their attorney has probably already explained that they have no grounds for appeal. Most likely, they will pay the judgment and hopefully leave you alone. Robert was right. The HOA did not appeal. Instead, I received a formal letter from Gregory Mitchell stating that the HOA was accepting Judge Thornton's ruling and would pay the judgment in full. The letter also included a terse apology, clearly written under protest. Patricia resigned as HOA president a week later. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that there had been a massive blowout at a board meeting where homeowners demanded her resignation. The HOA had spent over $50,000 in legal fees, plus the $10,000 in damages and my attorney fees, all for a case they were doomed to lose from the start. Susan was elected as the new HOA president, and one of the first things she did was reach out to me. Brandon, I want to apologize on behalf of the HOA for everything you have been put through. This should never have happened. I appreciate that, Susan, I said. I never wanted to fight with the HOA. I just wanted to farm my land in peace. We understand that now. And actually, the board has been discussing some changes to the covenants. We want to make them more flexible about things like vegetable gardens and maybe even allow chickens on larger lots, with some reasonable restrictions. That sounds great. Let me know if I can help with that. Life slowly returned to normal after the lawsuit ended. I continued farming and my operation grew. I added more beehives, expanded my vegetable garden, and even started offering farm tours for local school groups. The goats became neighborhood celebrities, and kids would often stop by to pet them and feed them treats. Several of my neighbors started their own gardens, inspired by my success. A few even got chickens, working with Susan and the new HOA board to establish reasonable guidelines that allowed small-scale backyard farming while still maintaining neighborhood aesthetics. The financial judgment from the HOA came through about 6 weeks after the ruling. $10,000 in damages, plus $47,000 in attorney fees. It was a substantial sum, and I used part of it to make improvements to my farm, including a new barn and better fencing. But the best part was not the money. It was the principle. I had stood up for my rights, fought back against unjust HOA overreach, and won. And in the process, I had helped establish legal precedent that would protect other farmers in Iowa who found themselves in similar situations. About 6 months after the case ended, I ran into Patricia at the grocery store. She was in the produce section and I was picking up some supplies. We made eye contact, and for a moment I thought she might just ignore me. But instead she walked over. "Mr. Henderson," she said stiffly. "Patricia." There was an awkward silence. Then, to my surprise, she said, "I owe you an apology. I was wrong about your farm. I let my concerns about property values and neighborhood standards cloud my judgment. I should have looked into the legal issues more carefully before pushing the board to sue you. I was genuinely shocked. I appreciate you saying that. I've had a lot of time to think since resigning from the board," she continued. "I realize I was too rigid, too controlling. I thought I was protecting the neighborhood, but I was really just being difficult for the sake of being difficult." "We all make mistakes," I said. "The important thing is learning from them." Patricia nodded. "I have been reading about right to farm laws and agricultural protections. I had no idea how extensive they are. If I had done my homework, I could have saved everyone a lot of time and money." "True, but maybe something good came out of it. The new HOA board is a lot more reasonable, and several neighbors are now growing their own food." "I suppose that is true." She paused, then added, "Could I buy some eggs from you sometime? I have heard they are excellent." I smiled. "Sure, stop by the farm anytime." Patricia did stop by a few weeks later to buy eggs. She was polite and even complimented my operation, though I could tell it pained her a bit to admit that my farm was well organized and attractive. But it was a start, and I appreciated her willingness to admit she had been wrong. As the months went by, my farm became more integrated into the neighborhood. I started hosting seasonal events like pumpkin picking in the fall and strawberry picking in the spring. Kids loved visiting the animals, and parents appreciated the educational aspect of seeing where food comes from. The HOA even featured my farm in their newsletter, which Susan thought was hilarious given the history. "From public enemy #1 to neighborhood attraction," she joked. "That is quite a transformation." "People just needed to understand what I was doing," I said. Once they saw that I was not creating a nuisance or bringing down property values, most of them were supportive. The legal victory also had ripple effects beyond my immediate situation. Robert told me that he had been contacted by several other farmers in Iowa who were facing similar HOA disputes. Judge Thornton's ruling was being cited as precedent, and in at least 2 cases, HOAs backed down once they were shown the legal implications. "You started something bigger than just your own case," Roberts said. "You are helping protect agricultural rights across the state." That made me proud. I had never set out to be an activist or a test case. I just wanted to farm my land. But sometimes standing up for your own rights ends up helping others too. Looking back on the entire experience, I learned several important lessons. First, know your rights and do your research before starting any project that might conflict with HOA rules. I had done my homework about agricultural exemptions, and that preparation was crucial to my victory. Second, document everything. The security cameras, financial records, and detailed documentation of my farming activities were essential evidence in court. Without that documentation, the case would have been much harder to win. Third, do not be afraid to fight back against unjust rules. HOAs have a lot of power, but they are not above the law. When they overstep their authority, homeowners have legal recourse. And finally, try to build community support. My neighbors ultimately made a huge difference in the case. Their testimony and support showed that Patricia's claims about me being a nuisance were exaggerated. Building positive relationships with the people around you can be just as important as legal arguments. Today, my farm is thriving. I have 30 chickens now, 6 goats, 8 beehives, and a large vegetable garden that supplies produce to several local restaurants in addition to the farmers' market. I am making a modest but steady income from farming, enough to cover my expenses and then some. More importantly, I am living the life I wanted when I bought this property. I wake up each morning to the sound of roosters crowing and goats bleating. I spend my days working outside, tending to plants and animals and connecting with the land. It is hard work, but it is deeply satisfying in a way that my software engineering job never was. The HOA situation, as stressful as it was, actually strengthened my resolve and my connection to farming. Fighting for my right to farm made me appreciate it even more. And knowing that I helped establish legal protections for other farmers gives me a sense of purpose beyond just my own operation. Susan remains HOA president, and under her leadership, Meadowbrook Estates has become a more flexible and welcoming community. The covenants have been updated to allow reasonable agricultural activities on larger lots, and several families have taken advantage of the new rules to start gardens and keep chickens. Patricia, surprisingly, has become something of an ally. After our conversation in the grocery store, she started volunteering at a community garden in Cedar Rapids. She told me once that fighting me made her realize how out of touch she had become with where food comes from. Now she is passionate about urban agriculture and food security. "You changed my perspective," she admitted to me one day when she stopped by to buy cheese. "I was so focused on property values and rules that I forgot about what actually makes a community healthy. Fresh food, connection to the land, knowing your neighbors. Those things matter more than perfectly manicured lawns." It was a remarkable transformation, and I was glad to see it. People can change when they are willing to examine their assumptions and admit mistakes. As I sit here now, watching the sun set over my fields with my goats grazing peacefully and chickens roosting for the night, I feel deeply grateful. Grateful for the land, for the legal protections that allowed me to keep farming, and for the community that ultimately supported me. The fight with the HOA was difficult, but it was worth it. I proved that individual rights matter, that unjust rules can be challenged, and that agricultural heritage deserves protection even in suburban developments. My little 10-acre farm is my piece of the American dream, and no HOA was going to take that away from me. The agricultural exemption protected me. The law was on my side, and justice prevailed. That is the story I will tell for years to come, and hopefully, it will inspire others to stand up for their rights when faced with overreaching authority. Farming is not just a business or a hobby. It is a way of life, and it deserves to be protected and celebrated.